Welcome back to Autodesk Maya, and this tutorial is the continuation of the Game Objects project. This is a tutorial basically on how to clean up your scene. So we're going to clear out the history of the objects, we're going to freeze transformations, and set the pivot to the ground. We're going to start off by centering the pivot and then drag it down to the ground plane. And we're also going to organize our layers and our file scene and everything else. So I've kind of done that already. Over here on the right, we'll check a look at my display layers. I have the ground layer here. And the lights is the top two layers. I recommend having those the top two. And then at the bottom I have these miscellaneous. These are the things that maybe I made a copy of. Like the lightsaber is large, full size versus the small size that's rotated. So any copies you have, you can set up a miscellaneous folder. And then everything else is pretty much an object. So we have cement barrier, we have the barrier, we have a saber, which is very small on here, but there it is. It's with all its detail. If I zoom in there, there's the saber, the chair, the crowbar. We got the oil drum and large column and the column layer. So we don't do anything with the crate yet. So, and you can see it's not lined up on the ground plane yet. So there are some issues. Also notice over here in the outliner, we have the same issues with everything being nice and organized in terms of grouping, the naming conventions and so forth. Now, the channels aren't all cleaned out, so we could do that with each of these. But overall, they're all set up, and then I have a miscellaneous folder for everything. And then all these pieces here are part of the cube here. So the first thing I'm going to do is select all these objects here, and all my other objects, I've done this already. I want to delete the history. So if I click on just one of these to show you, you have these inputs, everything that you've done to the object, the history of the object. So I want to actually delete that stuff. So I'm going to select all these objects and then go up to edit and go delete by type, and you can choose history. You can also do delete by all type and then click history, and that will delete everything in your scene, which is really nice. So each of these objects now has a clean history, but all the transforms aren't cleaned out, but that's okay. So we're going to set up that right now. We're going to select everything, and to delete out the transforms, we can go to the modify and go down here to freeze transformations, and that will freeze out the transformations. And then if you go to modify, you can also center the pivot at this point for each object. And then so now when I select an object and I hit the W key, each one will have its own center point, which is nice. And then what I ultimately want to do is group this, because I don't want to go through and select individual pieces. So I'm going to hit Control G to group it, and then I'm going to rename it. So Group 7 is not a very good name. So I'm going to call it Crate, and then GP for group. So and then you can see it's not lined up correctly on the stage here. So let's go to one of these ortho views, and let's go ahead and just move it up so it lines up with the ground plane here, like so. So now it lines up with the ground plane, but notice the pivot is not lined up with the ground plane. And so there's some issues here that'll happen if you try, for example, scaling up the object. If you want to move it around, it's just going to be problematic. So what we can do is move this by hitting the D key. So if I hold the D key down, or the insert key, I can grab this and sort of drag it down to the bottom here. And I want it to literally be in line with the bottom line here. And then once I do that, I release the D key. So now, if I move around here like this, now you can see this little green cube here, or little square. I can drag this, and it always remain on the ground plane as I drag it around, which is really nice. So that's really cool. The other thing I want to talk about was in terms of scale. So this is also really good for scaling. So if I turn on back my other layers here real quick. Don't want miscellaneous, but I do want my ground plane on. There we go. So for example, the column here, I have a large column and then I have a small column. And the small column is a little too small. And so I realize that, especially when I relate it to the other objects here. So I'm going to select one aspect of the object and then hit the up arrow to get the group. And you can see that it is aligned to the ground plane here. So now when I scale up by hitting R, I can scale it up and it scales uniformly from there. So it doesn't distort the object. So it scales from the bottom, so I don't have to basically move it up or down. it's already on the ground plane, which is really nice. So this is really cool for scaling objects. So I'm going to scale it probably about that much, maybe like maybe a little less than half of the other one. Something like that looks pretty good. And then for each of these grouped objects, like you see the GP, if you like the position of the objects, we could talk about setting up our scene the next tutorial and a final render. But if this was the final position, then I would want to freeze these transformations. And again, go to modify and freeze transformations, and that will kind of zero everything out. So now if I ever need to go back to that spot, if I was going to animate this for some reason or move it around, I can always highlight these values and type in a 0 to clear it out. So you want to do that with each object. Just make sure each group, again, you can select an object on the group and then hit the up arrow, and then you should have it. And each one should be freezed up. So you can do that with each of these. You can see this one is not frozen. And I've actually set up on the custom shelf here a hotkey for that. So I'm just going to click on freeze transforms, the FT here for that one. And actually I have little groups here, so I can actually click on them in the channel box here and do this. So I'm going to hit FT for that one, the large column, FT, and let's see, the other one's done, the oil drum's done, the barrier's done, saber is not, because I moved around a lot and scaled down, so I'm going to freeze those transforms. The cement barrier is not, so I'm going to hit FT for that one. And let's see, the crowbar, same thing. And the miscellaneous items I'm going to leave alone. These are extra groups that are no longer part of anything. So what I can do with those is just delete them. So that it cleans it up. And then I have the crate here. But in terms of stacking order, it is below the other groups and below the miscellaneous aisle. So I actually want to move this up. You can do this by holding the middle mouse button down and just drag up. And you just want to make sure you don't want to put on top, because see how there's like a big rectangle around that, but you want to see a line. When there's a line, that means you're between the two items. So when I release there, now the crate is right there. And then lastly, I need to add it to a display layer if I was going to make sure I have this in here. So with this selected, I'm going to click on the display layer, and I'll double click on it to name it, and I'll call this crate layer. So let's call it crate layer. And then click go save. And now you can turn off the visibility of that layer. And then I can move this layer down because I want it below the ground layer here. So I'm going to use this little navigator here to kind of move it below there. So now I have my lights, my ground layer, and then all my other objects in my scene here, which looks good. So everything is pretty much cleaned up. All the pivots are moved to the bottom, so I can always move them and scale them, and everything's set up. So the last thing I do is save your work. So I'm going to go File, and before you save, if you haven't set your project, you can go File, Set Project. I have done that, but if you need to do that, you can do that, and go File, Save Scene As. And this time, I want to clean up even my Scenes folder. So instead of this Furniture 6, which is kind of not really descriptive, I'm going to call this Game Objects, and then I can call it Final or Complete, or I could just leave it as Game Objects, and that would be fine since I didn't name anything else Game Objects. And then click Save As. Now in my Scenes folder, I'll click Continue here. In my Scenes folder, I would eventually want to clean these up so that basically the game object is the only one in here. So I could right click in here and create another new folder and called it, older scenes or something like that. And then I can drag all of these and put them inside the older scenes folder just like that and move them in. And now we have the game objects just all cleaned up. So nice and clean and tidy. So in the next tutorial, we'll probably cover rendering, and that will be the final one. So until next time, see you soon in Autodesk Maya. Cheers!